Hello, everybody. I am so delighted to welcome you to the two panel discussions that close, at least for now, Berkeley's Gender and Women's Studies exploration of social reproduction in and under crisis. I'm Leslie Solzinger, Vice Chair of Research for the department, and it's so great to have you here. The last 13 months have been a deeply strange and traumatic period for all of us. But the talks in this series have shown the ways in which the short-term crisis of the virus only compounded a pre-existing crisis of social reproduction, the long impossibility of making and supporting life under heteropatriarchal racial capitalism. All semester, our speakers have delineated the ways the pandemic has both exacerbated and also revealed the gendered and racialized conditions under which reproduction takes place today. Fortunately for our spirits, beyond helping us to grasp the contours of this slow disaster, some of them have also done the work of helping us imagine ways beyond the present. The three scholars in this first panel have brought their widely varied, brilliant thoughts to that conversation, delineating the long-term crises within which the pandemic erupted and thinking through the possibilities of resistance and change. We have so much to learn from hearing them speak to each other. Before anything else, let me start with 1,000 thanks to Gillian Edgelow, who's kept this rather complex set of balls up in the air all term, and thanks for financial support to the Xiaohou Xuan Foundation. So let me give you a sense what's coming. First, there are two panels today. The first discussion will go until 11 a.m. Pacific. The second panel with Nancy Fraser, Titi Bhattacharya, Mignon Duffy, and Maggie Dickinson will start at noon sharp. We hope you can join us for both events. If you can only make one of these, or if after hearing these discussions you're inspired to listen to the original talks, you'll be able to find it all on the GWS website. The link for that is in the chat. You can also sign up for our mailing list if this kind of programming interests you. There'll be more wonderful speakers next year. So to give you a sense of structure, after introducing our panelists, and I'll keep that relatively short since they were all here before, I'll ask them all a question. They'll each speak for a few minutes, and then they'll have a chance to respond to each other. We'll do another question, another round, that is question, response, discussion. And after that, we'll throw the floor open for you to jump in. If you have a question, we're asking you to speak it out loud rather than having me speak it for you. Once we move into that part of the program, those with comments, please raise your Zoom hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. Of course, if you don't feel comfortable speaking or your mic isn't working or any of the many reasons that might not work, you're welcome to write the question in the chat. In that case, please include a note for me and I'll read it out. If there are a lot of questions, we'll take them in groups. So Cinzia Ruzza is a feminist philosopher and organizer, an associate professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research. Her interests span ancient metaphysics and political thought and feminist theory and Marxism. She's the author of many articles and two books, the first on tyranny in Plato's Republic, and the second, the widely circulated manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, which is co-authored with Titi Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser, who will join us in the afternoon. Cinzia was also one of the primary organizers of the global women's strike movements, which began in 2016 and have radically marked International Women's Day around the world for the last 4 years. Her talk for us this spring focused on these inspiring and important movements, which make visible profound sexual and reproductive violence, and in so doing, change the present. She'll get us started. Chiara Bridges is a professor here at UC Berkeley School of Law. She's trained in law and anthropology with both a JD and a PhD from Columbia, and has written extensively on race, class, reproductive rights, and the intersection of the three. She's the author of a raft of significant law articles and 3 books on pregnancy as a site of racialization, the poverty of privacy rights, and critical race theory. She also directs the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice here on the Berkeley campus. Her talk for us this spring looked at the nexus of environmental racism and reproductive injustice and the living trap this creates for Black people when they're pregnant. This work poses the challenge of social reproduction under racial capitalism in the starkest possible terms and brings both climate and the body into the center of our discussion. Dean Spade is a lawyer, writer, and trans activist and associate professor of law at Seattle University. His first through line of work discusses and critiques forms of trans activism organized around equality and civil rights. That work includes his book, Normal Life, as well as many forms of scholarship and public writing. In recent years, this has evolved into a more direct focus on solidarity and mutual aid. Dean has a newer book on the subject that came out last fall entitled Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. Here, as in his earlier work, he combines scholarly work with more public-facing writing, podcasts, etc. He's also a member of an important activist group doing this work, the Big Door Brigade, whose motto is solidarity, not charity. In the lecture with which he inaugurated this series in February, Dean talked about doing social reproduction otherwise, evoking a world in which we make and sustain each other. So a big cross the wires welcome to all three of you. I wanted to start at the most general, so I wondered if you could comment on the overlapping scales of the crisis. So, and maybe Cinzia, we could start with you. What do you think has made the pandemic, what do you think the pandemic has made visible about this long durée of the crisis we face in the moment?
Yeah, I mean, trying to be very short. First of all, thank you, Leslie, and thank you to the other panelists. It's really great to be here with you. And I apologize in advance, I'm struggling with the seasonal allergies, and this is why I may look a bit fuzzy. But so in the Feminist Manifesto we wrote together with Titi Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser, we spoke of the interconnection of a number of crises that are actually taking place today. Of course, the financial economic crisis that started in 2018 and has never been really resolved. A political crisis of legitimacy, especially a crisis of legitimacy of neoliberal forces. The ecological crisis, obviously, which is clearly not even more looming on the horizon, is really here already. And a crisis of social reproduction. And by this, we meant the fact that the pressure upon the reproduction of life has become, in the past decades of austerity measures, neoliberalism, attacks to the welfare state, to public service and so on, and also with the lowering of the cost of labor, and therefore the necessity for multiple members of the family, of a household, to be involved in the labor market and so on. I started really putting an enormous amount of basically unbearable pressure on households and families of all kinds. Now, what we can see now during this pandemic is that the pandemic is, on the one hand, acting as a magnifying lens, which enables us to really look these contradictions and this crisis that we were talking about, and not only us, also others were talking about. And the pandemic has made these contradictions extremely visible, much more apparent, much more accessible in a sense. On the other hand, it is also playing the role of an accelerator of these contradictions, both in terms, for example, of political crisis, obviously the effects on the economic crisis, but also in terms of the pressure on social reproduction, especially on households, because basically all of the lockdown measures that have been devised and put in place in the past months in order to try to stop the pandemic or mitigate the pandemic have been predicated upon the idea that the household was basically the family was basically the main site that would then handle the consequences and the effects of the lockdown without basically any help from public institutions and so on. And from this, for example, emerged the necessity for feminist movements around the world to organize, forms of mutual aid from below, precisely to somehow compensate within a process of struggle for the lack of help of any kind and support of any kind for these, millions of families and people completely left to their own devices. All of this has been, let's say, said several times, so I don't want to spend much time on this. But the last thing I wanted to say is a further reflection on two counts. One is that I think government's decisions and policies during this pandemic have made really clear what we have been saying for years, which is that this is a form of society and a system that is predicated upon the priority of the accumulation of profits over the reproduction of lives. And this has been made really literally clear by the management of the pandemic, because the first imperative has always been from the very beginning how to make sure that people continue to work and produce, even at the expenses of their health, well-being, and so on. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of this dynamic has been also that, at least in some countries, this has generated new contradictions, this time among women themselves, and not only among women divided along class lines, but actually even among, for example, working class women. I'm going to give the example of Italy, and then I will finish here. But this is another, let's say, contradiction, let's say, that has been exacerbated and even generated by the pandemic in these months. In Italy, for example, there is mounting pressure for reopening schools, no matter what, even in the absence of basic measures of safety, protection for the teachers, but also for the students themselves, coming directly from working class families, and especially from women who are actually mobilizing even a pseudo, let's say, feminist language of the kind, this pandemic is making it impossible for us to work. It is a step back or a backlash in terms of our freedom as women, gender rights, and so on. All of this within a context in which the large majority of teachers and employees in the public system, school system, obviously is women or feminized people. And so basically what we have seen was really a growing contradiction of interest, demands, and needs among basically women belonging to the working class, but positioned in different ways in terms of workers within a workplace, giving a service, education, and so on, and let's say the customers in a sense. So how to address also this? So I'm saying this, and this is the last thing I want to say, because on the one hand, we may think that the fact that the pandemic has made all these contradictions more visible can create new spaces for struggle. And I do think this is true. On the other hand, we also need to take into account that it also created further divisions according to race, gender, class, but also within class, race, and gender. Contradictions that it is extremely difficult to tackle and to address.
Kiara, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with everything that Cinzia has said. I think that the pandemic has made visible things that we already knew existed, and it has made visible things that those who were paying attention knew existed, but it's made it visible to folks who weren't paying attention. And so hence it's, front page news, hence it's like, oh my gosh, can you guys believe that, women are having a hard time juggling work and caretaking, but we already knew these things. And just to be more specific about things that we already knew that racism was damaging people's bodies, right? We already knew that structural racism in the form of environmental injustice, structural racism in the form of shuttling racial minorities into dangerous jobs, we already knew that was damaging their bodies. And so when we have a novel coronavirus that comes on the scene and then interacts with the damage that structural racism has already done, and we see racial minorities dropping like flies from this virus, it's just it makes visible, right? What had up until then been invisible in the form of hypertension or diabetes, or the other comorbidities that make the novel coronavirus that much more deadly. So we see that invisible damage in the form of higher mortality rates from COVID-19. We already knew that we were treating the environment like an object to consume, like a thing from which we can extract resources, as opposed to something upon which we rely for our very survival. And so we encroach the environment, we consume the environment, and then we encounter a novel coronavirus that is deadly to humanity. So again, we had already known that we needed to be more careful about or be more respectful of the environments in which we inhabit. And so the coronavirus has made it kind of obvious that this isn't just a matter of, oh, we need nice places to hike, but it's like we actually need to respect the environment in order to not kill ourselves. And then when it comes to labor, we already knew that people were in impossible circumstances when it comes to laboring for a wage in the market and then coming home and doing domestic labor, uncompensated domestic labor. We already knew that, created impossible circumstances for many folks. Nevertheless, the pandemic kind of crystallized that impossibility in so many dramatic ways. And so I love the word that Cynthia used, an accelerator, right? I think that all of these things I think we had realized resistance to all of those things, right? And that's just, that is not a comprehensive list at all. That's just the things that I jotted down on this page just now. But I think we had already experienced resistance to structural racism, resistance to environmental injustice, and resistance to the impossibility of being a wage laborer and a domestic laborer. But I think that what the pandemic has done is accelerate that resistance in some important respects. I think it's a welcome. If the pandemic has done anything positive, I think that what positive it has done is to accelerate the resistances to these violences, these systems that have been normalized. And I actually want to mention one other thing about the things that we already knew. We already knew that capitalism is brutal. Like, we already knew that there's a brutality in allowing for the profit motive to govern everything. And so then when we see capitalism do what capitalism does, and compel, and especially when it has the support of a state that seems more interested in protecting the profit of companies over the humanity of individuals. When we see the state allow companies, allow business, allow capital to force workers to return to work without even guaranteeing, as Cynthia mentioned, in the context of schools, without even guaranteeing safety, and also without even guaranteeing the ability to recover if a person becomes ill. I think that's just like such a dramatic demonstration of the brutality of capitalism. And when capitalism has the full support of the state. So again, all of these things existed prior to the pandemic. The pandemic made them visible, and it's also accelerated resistances to all those things. So I'll stop there.
Do you want to jump in here?
Sure, yeah, there's such brilliant things to build off of here. I mean, everything that you two were saying made me just think about how, like, this is like what all disasters do, like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the recent winter weather in the South. I mean, every fire, like, it all does this acceleration and exposure. That was just going through my head. I mean, I think one way I think about this with the pandemic was that it made totally plain how utterly disposable certain people are. Like, we don't care if a lot of old people die as long as we keep the stores open, and we don't care, like, prisoners, old people, Black death, Indigenous death, just like that level of, like, we are here to make as much these billionaires as rich as possible, like the feeling of that, and the constant headlines about the growth and wealth concentration during the pandemic. I think so in some ways it's like a moment of just like greater clarity to more people about like just fundamentally what the United States is. And I think for some of us, like maybe what the nation state is. And at the same time, the pandemic period has really exposed the ongoing fantasy, including by a lot of people who consider themselves on the left, of a savior state. Like that's really clear to me that people like really keep thinking that like that's going to show up. And it's fascinating to watch that with the projection on the Biden-Harris presidency and then like the brutal realities of the consistency. I think also, you know, of course, a lot of my work is about like mutual aid these days, and it's like the capacity for us to save each other's lives and to self-organize is really clear. And a lot of new people have taken up political action in this period and taken up mutual aid. And so it's also the capacities for our movements to build, the capacities for that action to become more bold. I think I've really been seeing that, especially in the last few months, as there's been more defense of places where homeless people are camped, you know, in Los Angeles and Echo Park and in Seattle and Cal Anderson. And it's happening a lot of places people are engaged in both the mutual aid that's about giving each other water and food and picking up each other's prescriptions, but also the mutual aid that's about fighting the cops and fighting ICE to stop them from taking our people or from evicting us. And, you know, people blocking the doors of housing court, you know, like this, to me, that's where this is going, because we're just like disaster after disaster, like that's the rest of our lives is what it's going to be. I think we've also seen, again, the processes of mainstreaming co-optation that happen when resistance emerges. I can't separate the pandemic story, of course, from the uprising against anti-Black racism and police violence of the same period, which I think are very intimately connected. There's nothing new about that police violence, but what is it? What conditions allow people to take the streets more? And I feel like they have nothing to lose. I think there's something related to, obviously, to living through mass unemployment and disaster that, and young people being out of school, et cetera. But yeah, so we see that pattern that we often see of like when people start doing for themselves and it has to be co-opted. And so there's been a lot of narratives about mutual aid in like mainstream newspapers and media that make it seem completely like complementary to state control, which is not what I think most mutual aid activists think they're doing. And so that tries to make it into volunteerism and charity. I think we've seen the disruptive potential of disasters. We've seen that like they cause rifts that are actually potentially moments of politicization for people. I think we've also seen the concessions and reform cycle that come with uprising very clearly in this, you know, that it's like there will be concessions granted, limited concessions granted that will only reach a select set of people. Or that will be like limited reforms on paper. Obviously, we're seeing this around policing. It's the age-old response to opposition to police violence and racism is to do like limited reforms that are ineffective. Like, so that cycle has been really, really visible during this time because more people are mobilized. So it's more important to signal that the reforms are happening. And I think there's also something really interesting that's happened during this period, which is there's a lot more engagement at the municipal and county level in like detailed getting our hands dirty way, like especially in the defund police efforts that people are doing like way deep down into their county and city and state budgets. Like to me, that's a new level of work for abolitionists. And it's a different, I mean, not that no one's done that, but the amount of it that's happening. And I think it's a big experiment. I mean, in my city, it's turning towards this push towards participatory budgeting for the police budget to move it into the things that Black communities and most police communities want and need. And that is a huge experiment. Like, will we get that stuff? Will that stuff be given out in ways that we think is like actually going to reach the most people in the most crisis or not? Like that is an interesting development of this period. And the last thing I'll say is I think this period, helps us see that there's no help coming, that like things aren't about to reorganize to the place where certainly in the United States, where the United States government like starts to do right by us during all the crises that we are facing and that we are about to face. Like it's not happening. And so I think we're seeing more people facing that very difficult, painful reality, which involves shedding a lot of fantasies, and then noticing the power of networked, autonomous, proliferating action by groups of people. And that is, to me, like where the possibilities lie. And that includes pressure on government frequently in order to try to squeeze out concessions, but it's not like as if that's it's going to all get delivered if we just vote right or if we just like bring the right lawsuit. So I think that's an interesting moment of like of disorientation that I think is really freaking people out, you know, in a lot of different ways, and causing also strange further attachment in some ways to the savior state idea.
So interesting listening to the three of you sort of come at the same central object in different ways. And I have a bunch of questions, but I think maybe one is that it's striking to me, both from your talks and from what you're saying now, the sort of centrality of issues around violence to the problems with social reproduction. And I think in the sort of literature on this is not always that evident. I think very frequently that's not where the emphasis is. And I wondered if you could talk about how it is that especially so many forms of resistance have really started from pushing back against violence. I mean, you know, I think, Dean, as you were saying, it isn't really surprising that the pandemic has led to struggles against police violence, even though these aren't intuitively the same story, but obviously they are. I think, Cinzia, when you talk about all those, all the movements that you talked about in your talks a few weeks ago, those also start from resistance to violence and then end up talking about social reproduction. And, you know, and Kiara, I think in your work, this is obviously central from the get-go, but I wondered if you could talk about the way these speak to each other, these sort of questions around fundamental violence and around social reproduction, wherever you want to go with it.
Okay, should I go first again, or yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, let's start, you know, with the data we have already concerning the pandemic and gender violence. So already months ago, the United Nations even, you know, raised the alarm because they thought we were really facing an enormous increase in gender violence that basically even enabled us to speak about, you know, a serious crisis. And in fact, there has been at least a 20% increase in domestic violence, for example, during lockdowns, not only, by the way, against women, cis women, but also against trans people, queer people, genderqueer people, and so on. And the reason is quite obvious in this case, which is that clearly, you know, the moment in which the household becomes the place where you have to, you're supposed to be safe from the pandemic, from contagion, and so on, and it is also the household where all these tensions are basically offloaded. You know, the economic, you know, difficulties in paying the bills, having to work for those working, doing smart work, all in the same space, and all of this. Clearly, this creates, you know, a fertile ground for the explosion of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and also, you know, for example, for queer people, the pandemic has meant very often the necessity of going back to live with their, you know, parents or family of origin because of loss of jobs, because, you know, schools shut it down and so on. But family is not a safe place for many people, actually, perhaps for most. So this shows how, you know, it's just a simple example of the way in which social reproduction is immediately connected to the issue of gender-based violence and sexual violence. And clearly, you know, one could say that a different kind of management of the pandemic would have been possible, for example, without assuming that the household is the place where people should take refuge, but rather, you know, providing a range of possibilities for people to in terms of housing, lodging, and so on and so on. So this shows once again that, you know, how social reproduction is organized, you know, what policies a state take in relation to social reproduction and so on does have immediate consequences in terms of gender violence. Obviously, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that social reproduction theory or analysis of how social reproduction works is going to explain all of the aspects of gender violence. This is something I don't believe. There are multiple instances and kinds of violence that have different patterns, let's say, and different causes and dynamics. I do think that certain crisis of a certain kind of masculinity is also a trigger for for men losing their privileges, not being comfortable with women's freedoms or with the queer people freedoms and so on. All of this needs to be taken into account because we are speaking about, gender violence is probably one of the most entrenched forms of violence in our society. So I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking that social reproduction can explain all of this, but clearly what we can say is that social reproduction does play a key role in reproducing specific forms of gender violence. And I made the example of the lockdowns and the pressure upon the family, but there is also to be said that social reproduction has also to do with what kind of, what access you have to what kind of education, to what kind of food, whether you live in a food desert or not, how you get socialized, not just within your household, but let's say within the community in which you belong. Environmental racism, so what how much you are exposed to agents of pollution because of your race, because of your gender and class, and all of this basically contributes to somehow, let's say, mark people off as possible victims of state violence, as possible subject of state violence, as candidates, let's say, for the carceral system and so on. Once again, this is not obviously the only cause, but it is part of the process that basically, especially here in the United States, for example, makes a sector of the population basically constitutively exposed and vulnerable to state violence. And it is, of course, obviously Black and brown people in this country, but it is also a large chunk of, poor white working class that is also socialized, let's say, for prison in a sense. So I think that from this viewpoint, the fact that the feminist movements, started with the issue of violence, but then of gender violence, but broaden up what we mean by gender violence, and started also indicating different culprits. So the state as a rapist, not just the bad man, the prison system, or or borders, because an enormous amount of gender violence against not only women, once again, but also queer people is taking place within detention centers for immigrants, which are basically concentration camps. And in cases like Libya, for example, which cooperates happily with the European Union, these are basically torture centers where rape is routinely used as a form of control of the prisoners, humiliation, and so on. So, so from this viewpoint, just to conclude, I think that the movement was right. The movements were right in expanding what we mean by gender violence and in also identifying what in social reproduction, or let's say identifying social reproduction, one of the key contributions to creating the fertile ground, the conditions for gender violence to explode. At the same time, obviously, we need to avoid, let's say, automatism and mechanical explanations, and rather, embrace the complexity of the phenomenon as such.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and add that violence is a central, or I think it's a useful concept for thinking about the present moment and what the pandemic has revealed, because the violence evokes the fact that there are multiple ways to kill, right? There are multiple ways to produce death. And I think that the pandemic has revealed the multiplicity of ways that we can kill, right? So, as Dean mentioned, we are familiar, certain types of violences are familiar. So the violence of a police officer killing a Black person, right? That's a kind of paradigmatic dramatization of violence. But the pandemic has revealed other forms of violence, other ways to kill. So one can kill by forcing people to live in environments that have poor water, air, and soil quality. Forcing folks to live in housing that is replete with lead. That's an effective way of killing. Forcing folks to live in food deserts, and then also not providing them with the means by which they can access safe, affordable, quality, healthful foods. That's an effective way of killing as well, an effective way of producing death. An effective way of producing death is to make them sick by forcing them to live in these environments and then not guaranteeing them health care. Brilliant way of producing death. Other ways of producing death is to force them to return back to their jobs, to their workplaces, without ensuring their safety. Knowing that there is a deadly virus that we don't have effective treatments for, but then compelling them to work, right? So violence is a way of thinking through all of these active forms of killing and then passive forms of killing. And Dean said something in his remarks that I just have to respond to. Dean said that a lot of folks have realized that there's no savior state, like the savior state's not right around the corner. Like the problem wasn't exactly the Trump administration, but it's the way the state has always had a very close and supportive relationship of unregulated capitalism. So the question is just like, how little will this new state regulate capitalism? Not will the state actually manage the violences of capitalism and racism and sexism and homophobia and cisnormativity and et cetera, et cetera. But I just wanted to add that the reason that no savior state is coming is because these violences work for people. It works. It's a beautiful way of accumulating wealth. It's a beautiful way of making disposable populations that you don't want to care for. Violence works. It works well with neoliberalism and capitalism and racism and sexism and so on. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, what you all are saying is just so brilliant and so true and clarifying, and just also like that all the disasters make money and add new opportunities for political control. Yeah. And I was thinking about this too when you all were talking. Like, one of the things that's really painful about how violence is discussed in the U.S. is like we look at the moments where the police actually kill somebody, but we never talk about all the police violence that just disables people, traumatizes them, injures them, and causes their early death. Or we look at the COVID deaths, but we're going to ignore the chronic post-COVID conditions. Or I was thinking about a conversation I recently had with a friend who spent a lot of time organizing people with disabilities who need care, and then people who do the caregiving, in-home caregiving work, and trying to meld the labor organizing with the disability justice organizing to build better compensation for those people and better care. And just the amount of injuries people who do in-home care with children and old people and people with disabilities have from the lifting. And just when we think about social reproduction, I always think about, of course, Ruthie Gilmore has that definition of racism that's been so helpful to all of us, group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And what she does with that definition is she says, for me, at least, as a person who teaches in law school, people are obsessed with the intent of the racist. And instead it's just the proof is in the pudding. If people are dying younger, it's because something's going on, and white supremacy produces that. And so does ableism, and so does patriarchy, right? It produces worse life chances for people. And And I appreciate what Cinzia said about that, it's really true that like what social movements do is we contest the definition of violence. Like that is like a thing we consistently do. We're like, look, sexual assault is violence. Look, toxic pollution in communities is violence. Like we're constantly saying, like, look, violence is over here. It's over here. It's not where the state wants to define violence. It wants to say that that the police can never do violence because they're the answer to violence, and that the military can never do violence. It's the answer to violence. And here we are living in this country that I think is just like, it's like the place where the most people have died of COVID, and it's like the place where the military is the biggest polluter on earth, and like it's just these kinds of heavy, brutal realities about what empire is right now. And I mean, so important that the redefinition by feminists, which Cinzia mentioned, that like the family is violence, right? And so when I think about this a lot, I think about it in social movement context, that a lot of those points are being made by the like broad global anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, et cetera, movements of the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then there was like the neoliberal backlash in which we were told like the family is the place where you're going to get safe. And actually the family is a site of liberation because gay people can get married now. Like you just see these and I feel like we're in like a rupture post those attempts at recuperation. And there's a real battle going on about that as that recuperation project falls apart under the weight of the crises we're facing. I think one other piece I want to say about this is like the role of like the death of people in nursing homes in this crisis. Like forever and ever, disability justice activists who are abolitionists are like, those are prisons, right? And migrant justice activists are like, those detention centers are prisons. And we're like, you know what? Those schools are prisons. They have cops. So like just this naming of violence, like because we live in a context where we're told like schools and nursing homes are good and prisons might be bad. Like we're with this very thin, insufficient, purportedly progressive politics that fails to see the shared technologies of violence across these spaces. And I think the extreme death in nursing homes and prisons from COVID like really helps us bridge that. And the final thing I want to say is that, I mean, of course, like everybody watching this law that passed in Florida that, is aimed at trying to further criminalize protest and all these laws to make it okay to run over protesters. And just like, we're also in this pivotal moment which I think also happened in the 60s and 70s in the US, where people are questioning what's been working for a long time, the story that if you damage any property when you're protesting or get in anyone's way, then you're violent and that you're a bad protester, and that like, there's good and bad protesters. And I think that is obviously like a horrifying narrative designed to make movements insufficient and worthless and unable to make change. But I think we're also seeing somewhat of a rupture there. And then you see these defensive moves, which are scary, by the right to, or to make it a new level of crime to protest outside an elected official's house or to topple a statue. And this is a real front lines where, I feel desperate to help be part of conversations that make people who see themselves as like anti-racist or whatever, somehow woke, like stop the peace policing around protests. Like, it's just like, it's really heavy this moment. And it's because there are still a lot of people, including like, of course, like the president, et cetera, who are like, who maintain those narratives and think those, have a very thin counterfactual story about how like all the changes there have been won in the world was won by like sit-ins, and it's like, it's rough out there. And I think that's like a sort of pivotal fight in the current conversation about violence that I think is of great concern to feminists.
Yeah, there's so many interesting threads to follow in the three of what you're saying. But before I do that, I just want to say, for folks in the audience, if you could start just putting up hands, I'd be really delighted to call on you. And I want to throw one final question out for the panelists while that's happening. Hopefully those things can happen at the same time. But I'm really struck as the three of you speak about, as there's so much agreement, but I wonder if all your sense of the sort of basic targets of change are the same. And I'm just very curious, and we have two lawyers here. I'm just curious how you conceptualize like the targets of change, you know, where the state fits, where, I don't know, just how you think about where we push for change first and what could possibly be helpful. I think, Dean, you've been, you know, most explicit about some of that, but I think it's a curious, as you conceptualize the problem differently, you also, you know, conceptualize solutions. So I don't know, maybe we can go in the same order as people start thinking about questions in the audience as well.
Okay, this is a huge question. So, but I will say a few words. First of all, I wanted to start from what Dean said, with which I totally agree at the end about, you know, the risk of, you know, the peace police problem and the risks of competition. I must say, I may have been at the moment, but perhaps this is because of my location in New York, I don't know, a bit less optimistic about the situation now, because my feeling is that let's say liberal cooptation of the wonderful uprising of this summer has been so fast and so thorough that now, you know, I find myself being constantly solicited to, you know, discuss diversity in syllabi and so on, and the whole, you know, radicality of the mobilization of the discourse of this summer, where we were discussing not syllabi but like abolishing the police and the prison state and so on. This has been really quite shocking for me. But again, you know, it may be my personal location as an academic in New York and so on. And I hope this is the case, because I'm getting seriously demoralized about this. This leads me to 2 points I want to make in terms of political strategies. The first is that, unfortunately, I do think that electoral dynamics, so I do think that a completely autonomous politics that basically simply, you know, is completely separated from the state and seeks to build precisely this separation and so on, is constantly exposed to the effect of electoral politics, or what happens at the state level. And we are seeing this. So we have seen this in the past months. I would say that, I mean, I was fearing that although, I mean, I wanted to get rid of Trump, but I was also fearing that the election of Biden, the victory of Biden, would mark the coming back with a vengeance of a certain kind of liberal identity politics, which basically de-radicalize what identity politics originally was meant to be, as, you know, the Combahee River collective defined it, and therefore, you know, with the risk of somehow demobilizing the people who have been, you know, mobilizing and struggling and resisting on much more radical platforms and with very clear, concrete demands and ideas, or also alternatives, and so on. And I think this happened. So this is happening. Hopefully it's going to be provisional, but we can see already that, unfortunately, what happens within the state does have immediate effects also on the political dynamics of social mobilizations on the ground. So one problem we have is then how we address that level. So how, because the separation alone, let's say, doesn't necessarily solve entirely the issue. A second issue I wanted to mention is that, I mean, within the history of, you know, the workers' movement, social movement, you know, 200 years of history, there has been often a tendency to somehow oppose strategies based on prefiguration, mutual aid, autonomous collective organizing, self-organizing, and political strategies targeting the state directly, for example, with demands, with campaigns, and so on and so on. And I think there is no real need for this. So in other words, I think we need both. And this would be my very pragmatic suggestion. And just to give an example. So first of all, I think there is a way of interpreting and presenting, reforms or demands for reforms, not as suggesting that the state is our savior, because clearly is not only is not our savior, it is our problem, but as actually demands that we manage through collective power to impose upon the state. So basically resources, for example, that are already ours and we take back through the state and so on. So from this viewpoint, then the state is not the ally, but it is the target of bombard, let's say, with a set of demands that we manage to impose upon the state. Just to give an example, universal healthcare. We cannot get this, unfortunately, without going through the state. However, the issue is not that the state is our friend in this battle. The issue is how to mobilize enough social power and political power from the ground that you manage to impose this upon the state. So on the one hand, I do think that this kind of forms of struggle and mobilization are necessary, and especially in the context of a pandemic, the level of challenges at the level of healthcare are so enormous that clearly you cannot simply tackle them with our limited means of mutual aid or self-organization from below and so on. At the same time, it is very important to actually do organize mutual aid and also to somehow prefigure different ways of doing things. And just to give an example, a lot of movements during the feminist strikes have organized alternative childcare. It was, the cis men in that case, ally, in solidarity with the movement, taking on the job of childcare in order to allow then the other people to go to the demonstrations and so on and so on. So that there are, in Dean's talk, there were multiple examples of, forms of precisely the alternative organization of the reproduction of life within context of struggle. I think we do also need that. And we do need that precisely in order to denaturalize the notion that the state should be the prime provider of all of this, and to also show that, in fact, it is possible to implement different logics in the reorganization of social reproduction, which are not the logics put forward by the state in the service of capitalist accumulation.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Okay, so I agree with Cynthia when she says that the state is the problem. And if the state is the problem, then the state should definitely be the target, one of the targets. And I just want to be clear in my thinking that the state is the problem because the state has aligned itself with capital. The state has aligned itself with capital. And capital is in close conversation with racism, sexism, homophobia, so on and so forth. So if the state is the problem, or at least if the state is one of the problems, then the state has to be at least one of our targets in our struggles. I've never, ever, even though I am firmly ensconced in a law school, I've never felt that the law was the engine of change. I've always felt that the law is reactive. The law is reactive to social movements, to demands. And I think that when Cynthia talks about the acceleration of disquiet, the acceleration of organization, the acceleration of protest, that's what gets me excited, because as protest and dissatisfaction and disquiet gets accelerated, social movements gain power, and social movements then can make demands on the state that become ensconced in law. So again, I've always felt that social movements were the engines of change. The demands that social movements make become sort of codified in law. And that is when we witness the disciplining of radicality. So Chinzia was talking about syllabus, right? So I've also received those emails where they're like, oh my gosh, we are about to put together the syllabus and we want you to be a part of it because it's really going to reflect the energies of this summer. And it's like, well, it's a syllabus. I don't know how excited I am about that. So that is like an example of the disciplining of radicality, right? And I think that's the same that happens in law all the time. So if you think about the civil rights movement and the demands that the civil rights movement in the 1960s were making, and how those demands became disciplined but when it was codified into the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and how it, then became the subject of what the law does, which is to simply make even less and less radical, if ever a piece of legislation was radical, make less radical a law through judicial interpretations. Which is to say, if the demands of social movements get taken up in law, and therefore the state has to at least reorganize itself vis-a-vis its citizens, that doesn't mean that we all go home. Rather, that means that we have to wait for the hook, and we have to wait for the retrenchment. We have to wait for the disciplining of the demands, or at least we should expect those things, and then respond to those things via social movements. So our work is never done. So that's just the beginning of an answer to, what's the role of the state in the things that we have been talking about. One other thing I wanted to put on the table, and this is something that I'm struggling with, and so it's like a question for my co-panelists, is I'm worried, right? I'm worried that we are firmly in the middle of or experiencing neoliberalism at its finest, right? Like where the state cedes all obligations to the market, market logics reign, private actors then become charged with the task of, so the family, right? The family is the site of caring for vulnerability. We've privatized dependence. So that, I'm just describing what I take neoliberalism to be. I'm worried that the state will look at the mutual aid, will look at all of these, forms of self-organization, all of the private actors caring for private actors, and be happy, be pleased, because no longer will the state even be looked to as responsible for caring for vulnerable folks. So I'm just wondering about the cooptation, really, of movements that are radical, and then the disciplining of these radical movements by conceptualizing them as consistent with neoliberal logics. So that's a question that I struggle with, and I just wanted to end my remarks by putting it on the table.
Yeah, Kiara, I think that's a really important question. And I'd say like the main critique I receive of my work is people who are like authentically like have a lot of shared values, bringing that concern, like shit, neoliberalism has been this period where we've all been like, the state has privatized social welfare more and more into the nonprofit realm, has just like retracted like the horrible threads of support so that there's just more burden usually on women caregivers in general. And then the broader global structures, like I'm thinking about like critiques that have been made about how like neoliberal economic policies produce more disability in, countries targeted by neocolonialism, and then also produce more, care responsibilities for people with disabilities and, usually women. And I'm also thinking about like David Bacon's analysis in his book, Illegal People, about like the ways that like migrants from Mexico come to the US and then send their remittances back. And those are used to like fix roads that towns in Mexico can't fix because, or buy school books or basic medicine, yes, like I think there's nothing new about that in neoliberalism, and people have already been practicing mutual care to like survive that the whole time. So mutual aid has like mainstreamed as a term in the last year, and more people are doing certain kinds of COVID mutual aid, which I think is really amazing. But like that problem, like, I don't think that means that mutual aid work is aligned with the neoliberal agenda. It's just like, this is the reality we're in. Like, no one's saving us. We're saving each other. Like, we don't have the luxury to be like, this isn't the right thing to fight for. You know what I mean? Because like, it's not like, I feel like sometimes there's this passive expectation, like that some state's going to show up. And I just, you know, I'll just say like, what do I think the state is? It's not like, to me, like connected to capitalism. Like it is a extraction machine. The point of it, the United States from jump has been to like practice genocide on indigenous people, to enslave Black people, to the point of it is to organize extraction maximally. And it is doing a fabulous job. And that is why we have had just like a worsening wealth divide forever. That is like so extremely bad right now. And it's always, you know, raced and gendered. And so given that, I really agree with you, Kiara, right? The law is like, the US law is designed to facilitate that. And it only changes, it makes changes very late. And as, you know, critical race theorists talk about, it does this just to preserve the status quo, right? Preservation through transformation. Like it changes laws, say like, oh, we're going to get rid of like de facto apartheid, de jure apartheid in the United States and just have de facto, you know, like those kinds of changes are just designed to recuperate the extractive processes, right? And so to me, yeah, the law or the state are not what I'm looking for. And I want to say too, I feel like I've kind of like come out publicly as an anarchist in the last couple of years because these questions are on the surface. But for the place I got those politics actually wasn't anarchist theory. It was, I got that from a combination of reading the history of poor relief and looking at cycles of rebellion followed by a slight expansion in poor relief because people are displaced. Then there's rebellion. Then there's slight expansion of poor relief, and then it's contracted as soon as, right? And I cared about this because I grew up on welfare and then came into the mid-90s and saw the moment of the real extreme contraction and really cared about this as like my politics. So studying that and also practicing supporting people trying to get their benefits in courts and administrative hearings, and then also studying, of course, deeply and practicing with people and doing different kinds of women of color feminisms that have these central critique of systems that try to eradicate difference, right? Like women of color feminisms have this critique of institutionalization that's based on the idea that you should not unroll norms upon groups of people because there's always intra-group difference. And so instead they're asking for, you know, so many different theorists in that space are asking for like constant processes of self-critique and creation of horizontal processes of governance that allow us to see what we're missing and see who's missing and talk about what wisdoms have been left out. And that is just super anti-state, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, so then I found out anarchism also said the same thing, but that wasn't how I got there. You know, I really got there through feminist scholarship about welfare and other women of color feminist critiques. And so to me, you know, I really agree with both of you on this. Like the answer is not like ignoring the state. Like that's not an option, right? But I think, you know, the way I learned what the practice looks like is through abolition, right? It's just like, what do? We try to stop them from building more prisons and police stations and cop academies. We decriminalize stuff. We directly support people who are in prison now and communities most likely to be imprisoned, meaning trying to get people out, trying to give people commissary money who are in, you know, trying to get the cops out of the school, whatever, all those things. And we also build safety strategies that are autonomous from the police. So that's like maybe the prefigurative work, but again, also stuff people have always been doing because who's been able to call the police? Only certain sets of people, right? So there's like the abolition politics, but we could expand it to other areas, is so incredibly pragmatic. And it's all about a discernment. We're like, we do not want to build this thing. We won't accept any reforms that build this thing. So I think this is really interesting because in moments of disaster, people are like, well, yeah, maybe you can have a critique of the state, but we need the state when the disaster comes. We need the state to make the vaccine. We need the state to, you know, come when the hurricane happens. And yet everything we've ever seen is that poor relief and disaster relief are always done in ways that leave out the same sets of people and make certain people disposable and have strings attached and take back the relief as soon as they can, right? Like that's what it always does. I always think about how in Hurricane Sandy, they gave people loans. Like that was FEMA's relief with loans. Like that's so outrageously wrong. And that's just the people who like were homeowners and could apply for it. Other people just got nothing, right? Unless they got it from mutual aid. So if we know that, if we have no fantasy that the US government is going to figure out how to do not racist, not sexist disaster or poor relief, we wouldn't not fight for Medicare for all, but we wouldn't have any expectation that it was going to be delivered in a way that wasn't going to leave out the same people who always get left out, right? And so to me, I can be for Medicare for all and not have those illusions, or I can be, you know, in Seattle, part of pushing for this participatory budgeting process but I can also know that when if and when we move the money out of the police budget into this participatory budgeting process led by Black researchers, still it's going to like enrich some nonprofits, and like a bunch of people aren't going to get anything, especially like criminalized Black moms. You know, like we can just get real about that. So we're already always going to be organizing mutual aid for all the like extreme gaps, and it can always be pulled back. So to me, it's like, if we're going to turn towards state work, it's always the most local level has the most potential impact. Like we should be up in our city and county budgets. Like that's where a lot of the action is. But in the US, there's a hyper focus on the federal, and like that's the elite level, and like the elite organizations work at that level. And it's like these grassroots organizations that are unfunded are working at the city and county and sometimes state level. So like turning that around and just looking like, where are the levers? Okay, so in Washington state, it's state law that usually adds criminal penalties. So we got to fight the state level for that, but it's city budgets that are about cops, or it's, you know, how is the ICE tie-in happening? Can we close down the detention center? Like, it's just very pragmatic stuff about, but knowing what we're doing, we're not looking for the answers, and we're from those spaces, and we're trying to actually imagine like a public health strategy that does not rely on an extractive government. And I think people get really scared when they think about how would we create a vaccine program without a government? And I'm like, the government is in the way of creating like innovations in health. It's got its boot on the neck of like every person in the society except for 5, you know? And then, so the idea that I think that like, there's just such an attachment to the idea that we need to work at the scale of the nation state, which itself is like a colonial project, you know, that like is like trying to unroll something across this huge territory and then extract from it and then give back where it wants, you know, like that's a bad idea. That's going to lead to public health crisis already. It always has. That's what it's always done. So I think for me, it's like this combination of doing this very like pragmatic local work and being the sober reality, like, yeah, it sucks that like somebody could try to use our mutual aid projects as an example of like a Reagan volunteerism neoliberal thing, but like they're wrong and we still have to do them because everyone's dying, you know, and then also trying to imagine more broadly, which of course a lot of us turn to, like looking at the Zapatistas, looking at what's going on in Rojava, like looking at places where people are doing larger scale, you know, self-organized, collectivist, horizontal social reproduction. And I think that that's not impossible. And so for the rest of our lives, we're gonna have to both like fight the state really hard and the cops and the extractive processes, lay down on the railroad tracks in front of the coal trains, like all the things that people are doing right now. You know, we're gonna have to do all of that, and we're gonna have to take care of each other. And this is just what everybody's always had to do since like colonialism, slavery, et cetera, have produced these outrageous crises in people's lives. And actually, to be honest, like there's no guarantee we're gonna win. And like, it's really, really hard to see what like the pace of our movements versus the pace of climate change. Like, I want us to have Medicare for all. I don't know whether that's going to actually be able to happen. I think the bigger we build our grassroots movements, including like mutual aid is such a threat to the government that oftentimes they respond with a concession of giving that thing. I mean, if you look at like the 30s and the creation of the shitty welfare state in the United States, you can see that. So it's like what like our organizing and our production of as much disruption and as much survival as possible may yield concessions from the government, you know, but it's like, it's like the assumption is they're going to be inadequate. And so what are we trying to build? Like, that's how I think about this. But I mean, I'm getting a lot of pushback from all different kinds of socialists and people who don't think of themselves as liberals, but I think have a liberal attachment to the state. And it's an interesting conversation.
Oh, that was fascinating. Thank you. We actually have a few hands up, so I want to turn to the audience. So the first person who had their hand up was Shubhatri Dasgupta.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you could.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, okay. Thank you so much for this conversation. It has been very inspiring, like a breath of fresh air, perhaps, in this pandemic. My comment is rather unreformed because I mean, it is something that I'm trying to think through every day. Cynthia used a beautiful phrase that is universal life care. And of course, what we face in the pandemic is precisely a massive crisis of that. But I mean, these are problems that have existed in perhaps milder forms before and are now exaggerated by the pandemic. And one particular aspect that I want to hear from the panelists about, which I find to be extremely challenging to navigate on a day-to-day basis, is the epistemic violence of neoliberal capital. And what I mean by that is the more subtler forms of violence that drown us on a day-to-day basis, equating, for example, the ability to become a consumer with empowerment, basically valorization of the individual. And I mean, this whole process of neoliberalism reducing humanity into individual units, which is basically bringing out our worst vulnerabilities. And this I understand as, the sheer violence of capital on our lives through mass media, popular culture, what have you. And my question in that regard would be, how can we in theory and practice start addressing that? Because I mean, as I think Chiara pointed out, neoliberalism disciplines radicality for its own capitalistic gains. And that is a very big challenge when we think of organizing and forming solidarities. And I'm just wondering, how do we move beyond that? Forgive me, this was rather unreformed, but thank you.
Whichever of you wants to jump in.
I have a thought on that, just that something I've been talking to my students a lot about. So one response I get a lot when I give talks about mutual aid and why it's important to movements and what's been going on last year or longer is that people are like, but we're all burning out and it's so hard to do this mutual aid. And it's like, there's no end in sight. And, I spent my life doing mutual aid work, especially with people who are in prisons, and it's just like brutal. And so, I mean, obviously one answer to that is we just need a lot more people to do it all and to stick with it. So like, that would actually make it easier if more and more and more people did it. And I think that that's happening in some ways. But the other thing is like, that is so tied to the question of social reproduction is like, we cannot ignore that the reason our lives are so exhausting is because they're so individual and separated, right? So it's like each one of us has to like do all the dishes and make all the food and take care of the children and wash all the clothes. And like, if that stuff was more collectivized, which we really can do. And so in mutual aid moments, you have that. You're like, oh, the 5 of us are going to make a meal for 100, serve it in the park. But that's just one meal, right? And so I think this is like a key piece is just like to even examine how we are produced as individual consumers, and then to think about, and I think that this needs some work, and there was a lot more experiments around this in the 60s and 70s with different kinds of intentional communities, and people, worked on versions of this, and there's also a lot of dangers with some of those formats. But I think that like, this is kind of the next question is just like, people cannot sustain themselves in capitalism. The addiction to endless entertainment technologies, the kind of individual, I think all the time about cell phones and about how like when my foster father was a kid in West Virginia, in the 60s, they had a party line. So everybody who lived near them shared one phone line, right? And then when he raised his kids, they had a phone in their home that was just for their family. And then when his kids raised their kids, every single person in the house has a phone. Like this kind of like, it's how much money is being spent on phones, at that point, and then how many more hours people to work in their dangerous, horrible jobs to make that happen, or like, washing machines, et cetera, but just thinking about all of those shifts. And so this, like, how do we separate out the conditions that make it seem like resistance is too much work when we are doing so much more housework and other kinds of work because we're doing it in such small units? Like, a quarter of people in the United States live by themselves. And we don't need a society in which every single person knows how to cook a gourmet meal. And like, we need a society in which everybody is like getting to co-govern their communities. And so that some people are like trying to figure out how we can have energy without fossil fuels and in our neighborhood. And some people are trying to figure out, what's the best way to help kids learn how to do cool stuff and, whatever. Like, so I feel like that is, it's a really old fashioned feminist point, but it just feels so palpable to me when people are like, we're all too burnt out to do resistance work. And I'm like, yeah, that's real. Those are real conditions. This isn't like because we're lazy or bad, but somehow all people throughout history have fought these battles to their deaths, unpaid, and that is like, so I think we just need to look at like, what are the conditions, which I think that the question really brought up, that are producing that exhaustion.
I would just add that I think, so I agree with Dean, we are all exhausted. I joined the Zoom today, exhausted, but that doesn't, it cannot, we can't rest on that. We'll rest when we're dead. But I wanted to just note that I think it's important to use disasters like this as pedagogical moments, right? As Dean said, all disasters have done what the pandemic has done, which is to make visible banal violence right? And I think it's important for us to use these moments as pedagogical moments, and to not assume that people will take the lessons from these tragedies that they ought to take, because there are narratives that circulate that would that market tragedies in a particular way. And so to tie into the question, we have narratives that's circulating that are like, okay, so individuals, like, we have to separate from one another in the pandemic, like we have to stay away from one another. You have to figure out a way to get your groceries. You have to figure out a way to consume, use your consumer power to save yourself, right? So have your groceries delivered to you, have your meds delivered to you, don't go outside. And the reality is, I think that we should use, sort of teach that this sort of individual as cut off from society is a lie. We remember when there's no toilet paper in the grocery store. So even if you did have the money to buy the toilet paper, it was not there. That was because we were dependent on supply chains. We were dependent on other people and other places to produce what many realized for the first time in their life was a basic necessity, is toilet paper. So we are all interconnected, even though we experience our lives as very isolated by necessity because of the nature of the virus. So I think that our jobs, one of our many jobs during this pandemic, is to remind folks about the interconnectedness, remind folks that the framing of individuals as disconnected from others, from society, and then dependence, right? Individuals are dependent on other folks. I think we have to remind folks about just that truth, so that the neoliberal frame of everybody's in it for themselves, and as long as you have a bank account, you're good, exert your power through your ability to consume. I think that that's one way to disrupt those neoliberal logics.
If I can add just one small thing about mutual aid and the issue of cooptation, to which both Chiara and Dean referred. I mean, in the United States, for me, like the most politically interesting and productive experiences in terms of organization of mutual aid were basically Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And what was distinctive of that experience was that the organization of health clinics, free breakfast, and so on, was part and parcel of a larger process of confrontation with capitalism and the state in the United States, for which these militants paid a very heavy price, by the way, because the state never forgets you and never forgives you. So I'm saying this because I think, the problem, in my view, especially in a country like the United States, where this has been really a fast-paced process, there is the risk of what I may call the NGOification of mutual aid, where it becomes institutionalized, loses radicality, and so on. And for me, the really key issue is whether our interventions in terms of organizing, self-organizing mutual aid is connected to a process of mass struggle, collective self-organization, the emergence of a radical subjectivities, like, for example, the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement and so on, which is really, it becomes, let's say, a pole of attraction of a set of struggles and so on. Knowing that basically there is no, magic wand. So in other words, the moment in which this mobilization, this conflict starts, dwindling, then mechanisms of cooptation will be in place immediately. And but this is unfortunately how the dynamic unfortunately works. But let's say if we keep together, the attempt would be really to always try to keep together the two aspects. So in other words, to see mutual aid as one element within a comprehensive, radical grassroots struggles that takes also different forms and uses different tactics.
Yeah, I feel like answering, but I'm not going to. There's somebody in the audience who wants to say something, and there's a question that I wanted to read as well. So why don't we start with Catherine Bauer? You could speak your question, and then I'll jump in and read the last question. We can take them together.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I'm going to.
Yes, we all can hear you.
Okay, great. Oh, it's so funny because I can't turn my video on, so I don't know what I look like, right? Oh, I guess nobody else can see me. Okay. So I'm a first year at Berkeley studying gender and women's studies. And I'm also somebody who is advocating and entrenched in the student body. And one thing that I feel like I'm watching over and over again is students being dependent upon the university for things like free Wi-Fi or housing or food or even medical care, but also being harmed by the university, like, taking these classes and Zoom exhaustion and feeling like you're not doing good enough. And I'm watching as students, are sleeping for 14 hours or not sleeping at all. And, one thing that we talked about earlier was how the state perpetuates death and how there are multiple ways to kill. Dr. Bridges, I believe you brought this up. And people are coming to know that there is no savior state. And so as I think of the university as somebody entrenched in it and somebody watching its effects, I'm wondering how university mimics the state and how, our students, our professors coming to realize that there is no savior university. Has this been realized? And I guess, what do we do about it? Sorry if that's a little bit of a redirection from the conversation, but I was just kind of making that connection.
That is a really great question. Thank you. I just want to read this other question, which is quite different, and then I'm going to throw it to you folks for wherever you want to take these issues. So we also got a question from Jiwan Yule. Oh, I think Dean might have gotten.
Yeah, Dean was frozen. Oh, wait, he's back. He was frozen for a little bit. I noticed it. Okay.
Oh, good. Glad you're back. So this last question I'm just going to read out, and then you folks can take it where you see fit. So this is from Jiwan Yule, who says, thank you for the fantastic conversation. A question to Dean is how to make the US government and its imperialist tactics like vaccine monopoly accountable in the global context. Any thoughts on the internationalist visions on mutual aid praxis? So there you have from the university to the globe. All three of you can jump in if you.
Well, I think it's to answer Catherine Bauer's question, or to begin to address it, I would just say that I think it's useful to think of state-like institutions, right? Like, so we have the state, and then we have like sort of, state-like institutions, and I think it's a useful frame for thinking about UC Berkeley and other campuses, other institutions that's state-like. And I think the conversation that we had, and so you ended the question by saying it's a redirect, but I actually don't think it's a redirect at all. Like, I think all of the things that we have been talking about when it comes to the state and when it comes to caring for one another, in perilous times apply to the context of UC Berkeley students at UC Berkeley, right? So you have to make demands on the state, right? You have to organize, you have to wait for retrenchment, you have to wait for the disciplining of your radicality, and then you have to resist that disciplining. So I think that I applaud you for recognizing the state-like moves of Berkeley and other institutions. And the hour and a half long conversation that we've had should inform your resistance to what you have I think accurately described as a way of killing, right?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Like, I think that one thing I've really been pushing for students I meet, first of all, like Catherine, your analysis is so amazing to have just entered this institution and have this assessment is really, I'm just like, it's very beautiful. And I can't wait to see what kind of trouble you make. But I think most of my students are not aware of the vital history of student movements in all social movements globally. So like studying those like the movement for ethnic studies at San Francisco State and all the stuff that happened in Berkeley and, of course, locally. And then also like for me studying like the uprisings at the University of Puerto Rico or things that happened in Montreal, like big stuff that's happened recently and then also the backlash in the United States in which universities literally redesigned themselves to try to demobilize students. And part of that includes becoming like a services oriented thing. So it's like, you don't need to do anti-racist activism. We have a DEI person, or we have a like center for your people, and we'll have a day where we eat your food on campus. Like this, they have tried to de-radicalize, especially student of color resistance. And anti-military resistance by students, and feminist resistance. So one thing I think is essential, because students are just like living like under really bad conditions of precarity, is to do mutual aid on campus. So I think it's like to have students be like everywhere. Students are like, the college counseling service is like totally inadequate, and like they're racist, they're transphobic or ableist, and you can only get 6 sessions, and you can only get them on a waiting list, and like people are having like levels of anxiety and depression that are wild. And so we're actually going to create peer-based counseling and like support groups for survivors of violence, and or we're going to create like conflict mediation center for students, because we know that the school's disciplinary processes are super racist. Or we're going to create transformative justice processes on campus because we know the school's response to sexual assault is just focused on its own liability. So to me, that like the mutual aid on campus is vital to the kind of organizing that Kiara is talking about, that that builds a different kind of community on campus, that isn't one in which you guys are passive consumers, but instead in which you are producing the community you want. And it's terrifying to the school. And it both will yield concessions, but it'll also make you part of social movements that are yielding much more than just concessions from the university, which I think is exciting. And it's a great training ground for all the work you'll be doing your whole life. This question about internationalism is so important, and it's really huge. I think the thing I'll say about it briefly is just, I think what we see, I think there's a lot of efforts to make US movements not internationalist, and to make them domesticated, and to make them not see beyond the US borders. And there's a lot of deep training in the US that helps people be unable to see or to perceive the world. And it's very intense and it's very effective. So the internationalist moves being made by movements all the time is really essential. And I think even just like the tie between the movement for Black lives and for Palestinian liberation, or these examples we've seen in recent movements are so vital. Or people directing us to look at like US activity in Latin America to understand the refugee crisis, or to understand the climate crisis, et cetera. But I think that what that looks like on the ground is people just doing deep solidarity work and trying to internationalize everything that they're already part of. So if we're fighting about unhoused people in Los Angeles together, let's be tying it to studying what landless people in Brazil are doing. Like and then hear the calls to action from farmers in India or from people in Yemen about what it is they see as solidarity, especially as feminists. What are feminists in those places saying we can be doing as people living in the belly of the beast, that might be supportive of their struggles? And I think, and that often includes mutual aid. I think there's a long history of that. I'm thinking about Emily Hobson's beautiful book, Lavender and Red, about solidarity work in the United States in queer and trans communities in the 1970s with people in Latin America. And like they included mutual aid brigades, and just that's a beautiful account of that kind of internationalism. I'm personally really excited about this group, Dissenters, that's trying to build an anti-war movement in the US, and is starting with a first stage of building campus chapters all over the country of students doing anti-militarism work. But it's an abolitionist group. It's founded by abolitionists. It's really rooted in abolitionism and anti-racism. And I feel like it's and feminism. And it's just like to me, I'm just like interested in investing in formations like that are trying to mobilize people with an internationalist framework, because but it's hard. We are so far from that. So when you read your question, it's like, God, yeah, it's like we are not there. Like we feel our lack of organizing and lack of power right now. And I just want to also acknowledge that it's a tall order, and it's also like we have no choice but to try,
Cynthia, do you want to jump in with a last word before?
Yes, I think we are over time, so I will be really super brief on the internationalism issue. I mean, this is really a question that is very dear to my political heart. And in fact, over the past 5 years, within the feminist strikes movement, I don't know how many articles I wrote and how many conversations I had saying we need to strengthen international coordination, transnational coordination, and so on. And so going even beyond solidarity to start really processes from of transnational organization from below. Now, this is within the feminist movement, this is partially happening right now, in the sense that there was the besides the transnational organization of women's strikes and feminist strikes over 5 years, there is also now a network, Feministas Transfronterializas. Sorry, I cannot pronounce this. Sorry about this. It's 1 hour and a half of Zoom. For example, one of the events they are supporting right now is a march of indigenous women in Argentina who started from their own communities and are walking to Buenos Aires. And the march is focused on what they call terricidio, so the killing of the margarine of the earth. From this viewpoint, I think there are examples, also what Dean was referring to, examples of attempts to create transnational networks, networks of solidarity internationally, and so on. But I agree with the assessment that we are really very behind what would be actually needed, especially because in the past 20 years, capitalism has become so globalized. And the whole planet is so interconnected, and this has obviously also increased, capital's power over our lives and our conditions of existence, so that it is really necessary to manage increasingly to unite, let's say, the work on the ground, so the local dimension with the international, even better transnational one. Otherwise, we are never going to win. Sorry to close this with this, pessimistic note, but that's me.
Well, thank you both. And Dr. Bridges, who had to leave for another talk, speaking of total Zoom overload for everybody. But I really, really thank you so much for your initial talks, for this really generative conversation. I hope everybody can join us this afternoon for the next part of this. And thank you again. Take good care. Keep well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for organizing, and thank you, Dean.
Hello all, near and far. I am so happy to welcome you to the second of the 2 panel discussions that close, for now, Berkeley Gender and Women's Studies Exploration of Social Reproduction in and Under Crisis. I'm Leslie Solzinger, Vice Chair of Research for the department, and it is wonderful to have you here. This is the second of 2 panels today. The first was with Dean Spade, Chiara Bridges, and Cinzia Ruzza. It was a fantastic conversation, as I expect this will be too. If after hearing this conversation, if you missed the first and you're inspired to listen back to that or to the original talks, you'll be able to find it all on the GWS website. The link for that is in the chat. You can also sign up for our mailing list if this kind of programming interests you. The last year has been devastating. COVID has thrown capitalism's impact on social reproduction into sharp relief, making it clear that an economy organized around profit rather than sustenance endangers human well-being. Access to food, shelter, and care have become increasingly precarious, and the feminized, racialized people responsible for providing them are stretched to the breaking point. Working parents are between a rock and a hard place, and waged essential workers, from nurses to grocery cashiers, are paid in applause, appreciation, and still in minimum wage. All semester, our speakers have delineated widely varied aspects of these processes, and today we have the great pleasure of listening to them talk about these issues in conversation with each other. So let me give you a sense of what's coming. First, I'll introduce the panelists. I'll keep those short since there's a lot of us and we don't have a ton of time. Following introductions, I'll ask everybody a question. They'll each speak for a few minutes to that same question and then have a chance to respond to each other. Then we'll do a second round if there's time. And after that, we'll throw open the floor for you to jump in. If you have a question, we're asking you to speak it out loud rather than having me ventriloquize it for you. So once we move into that part of the program, those with comments, please raise your Zoom hand and we'll unmute you and you can pose your question. Of course, if you don't feel comfortable speaking or your mic isn't working or for any other reason you don't want to speak your question, then just put it in the chat, but then put a note asking me to read it out so then I know to do so. If there are lots of questions, we'll take them in groups. So before introducing today's speakers, I have to start with many thanks to Jillian Edgelow, who has kept this whole thing zooming along all term and today. Honestly, it could never have happened without you. And thanks for financial support to the Xiaohui Xuan Foundation. So to our panel. Nancy Fraser is the Henry Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. She's one of our foremost public thinkers, and her books, articles, and public interventions on capitalism, feminism, and care have really framed the conversation broadly for so many of us, both through rigorous theoretical analysis and crucial public interventions. She's the author of dozens of articles and the author, co-author, or editor, I think, of 13 books, starting with Unruly Practices in 1989, and including Justice Interruptus, Fortunes of Feminism, and a forthcoming book entitled Cannibal Capitalism that I am looking forward to seeing. She is also the winner of multiple awards, including most recently France's highest prize, the Legion of Honor, in 2018. Since in many ways you wrote the book on the subject under discussion, we are so delighted to have you join us for this part of the series. Mignon Duffy comes to us from the Department of Sociology at UMass Lowell, where she's associate professor and chair of the department. For the last decade and a half, she's done crucial research and writing on the labor of care and its imbrication with structures of inequality around race, gender, and other forms of inequality. Her first book, Making Care Count, brought multiple methods to bear on the organization of paid care, and she's the author of a long series of highly significant articles around the organization of care, as well as the co-editor of Caring Around the Clock. She's also co-chair of the Care Work Network, a national organization of care work researchers and advocates that are committed to bringing research and thinking on care into public conversation. Last March, she laid out for us the impact of the pandemic on care workers of every stripe. Maggie Dickinson is a cultural anthropologist, assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies at Gutman College at CUNY. Her wonderful first book, Feeding the Crisis, Care and Abandonment in America's Food Safety Net, documents and analyzes the necessary and troubling expansion of food assistance programs, both state and private, in the contemporary US. Dickinson locates these processes in the context of the stagnant wages and insecure jobs that make food insecurity such a problem for so many working people today. In her talk last spring, she laid out that disheartening history for us and located the pandemic within that long arc of ungenerous, profit-focused neoliberal provisioning. Titi Bhattacharya comes to us from Purdue, where she's the Associate Professor of South Asian History and Director of Global Studies. Titi is the author of The Sentinels of Culture and Social Reproduction Theory, a book that really laid out this whole area in really an important way, as well as co-author with Nancy Fraser and Cinzia Ruzza, Cinzia spoke earlier today, of the Globe Traveling Manifesto of Feminism for the 99%. She writes extensively on Marxist theory, gender, and the politics of Islamophobia, and is also an important public voice in The Guardian, Jacobin, and many other places. In March, her lecture laid out the lineaments of social reproduction theory and traced the consequences of the pandemic within that theoretical framework. We are so lucky to have the four of you here together in conversation, if not in physical proximity. So let me start, as I did this morning, with a general question. I wondered if you could talk, and maybe Nancy, you could start us off with what the pandemic has made visible about the longue durée of the crises we face in the present.
Muting. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Leslie, and thanks to Jillian. This is a great opportunity for me to be in conversation with people on this panel and with you, Leslie, and with your audience. And the theme, the topic and the question you pose could not be more pressing and more, let's say, close to my own heart. So I think that that what COVID has laid bare and disclosed for us is not just, may I say, the horribly depleted character of social reproduction in our society, but the way in which that issue entwines with several others. I think that, in a nutshell, that what this pandemic is a kind of perfect storm of the irrationality and injustices that are baked into capitalism. So I want to focus on capitalism, and I want to focus on the entwinements of several deep structural contradictions and crisis tendencies that are baked into capitalism, of which social reproduction is one. So my general idea, which I've written about elsewhere, is, and this speaks to that forthcoming book you mentioned, that capitalism is a social system that is primed to cannibalize its own presuppositions, its necessary presuppositions like social reproduction, but also the Earth's ecology, public power, and the expropriated wealth of racialized populations. So I think if we really look deeply at what COVID shows us, we're going to see all of these cannibalizations at work, and all of them intertwining with and exacerbating one another. So I want to just first start with the ecological question, which I imagine has been discussed earlier, but just to restate the obvious, which I think many of you know, that it was nothing other than capital's cannibalization of nature that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place, right? We know that this virus has been harbored for a long, long time by bats in remote caves, and that it made the zoonotic leap from bats to us by way of some bridging intermediate species. But I think what at least mainstream observers are not adequately realizing is that what brought the bats into contact with the intermediaries and the intermediaries into contact with us was tropical deforestation on the one hand and global warming on the other. These are the processes that destroyed species habitat, drove species migration, created new proximities and new transfers of pathogens. And these are processes that are driven by capital, by the thirst for profit. So we have already seen, even before COVID, a whole string of such viral epidemics produced under these conditions, and we will certainly see more. That's point one. Second point, the effects of COVID on humans would have been horrific under any conditions, but they have been made incalculably worse by another strand, another contradiction of capitalism, which has, like the previous one, been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. And what I mean is that apart from its cannibalization of nature, capital has also cannibalized public power. It has devastated the public capacities that we might otherwise have used to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. We've been through 40 years of austerity demands to slash social spending, including obviously public health infrastructure and basic research, with a few exceptions, and I really want to single out Cuba as the sort of shining light here. With few exceptions, most countries drew down their stockpiles of life-saving equipment. They gutted their diagnostic capacities, shrank their capacities for coordination and treatment, and even worse, devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, pharmaceuticals and manufacturers. And after all, these firms are constitutionally uninterested in and unconstrained by the public interest, but they now control the lion's share of the world's health-related labor forces and raw materials, machinery production facilities, supply chains, very important intellectual property, research institutions. In other words, everything that determines our fates in the pandemic moment. And they are a force majeure that is blocking concerted public action on behalf of humanity and other animals. Now, I know you guys have discussed this a lot, but I have to at least mention that the collapse of these already weak public systems converged with the gobbling up of care work in recent years in the private world as well as in the public. So the same regime that divested from public care infrastructure also broke unions, drove down wages, required increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. So in a sense, then it really exacerbated this very acute care crunch, which COVID has only further intensified. And I won't go into detail here because I know that you throughout this program have discussed quite a lot of how that looks in terms of the new burdens that are been dumped onto care workers, including especially women, whether employed or laid off or working remotely or working on the front lines, including as essential workers. In every case, the work of social reproduction has been really swollen by the pandemic, and it still falls largely to women, as it always has in the history of capitalism. But which women end up in which category of those things I quickly rattled off depends on class and on color. And just want to say two more words about each of those things before closing. I'm sorry if this is a little too long. But in terms of color, you know, if you go back to that ecological question, capital always quenches its thirst for so-called cheap nature, which is Jason Moore's phrase, by seizing the land, energy, and mineral wealth of racialized populations who have been stripped of the means of self-defense and are bear an undue share of the global environmental load, and now find themselves last in line globally for vaccination. This is obviously related to that intellectual property problem I spoke about earlier. And also at the national level, and focusing here on the United States, we know how deeply race has inflected the political and social reproductive strands of the crisis, how BIPOC communities here and elsewhere have been denied access to the conditions that promote health and rendered much more vulnerable. In fact, I would say that one thing that the pandemic has made visible, it's really expanded the meaning of the slogan Black Lives Matter, which now synergizes with the original reference to police violence. Now this question of another aspect of structural racism, right? Disproportionate vulnerability to infection and death. So just a quick word about class, because Leslie, you mentioned the essential worker category. And obviously, if we leave aside medical professionals, who are we talking about here? Migrant farm workers, immigrant meat packers and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, et cetera, meaning low-paid, non-unionized, precarious workers, disproportionately women and people of color. And these workers represent the face of the working class in this era of financialized capitalism. That class also includes the vast majority of caregivers of all kinds. I think that COVID has exposed another dirty secret here too, and that is it has juxtaposed and made visible the essential character of that class's work alongside capital's systematic undervaluation of that work. So in other words, the pandemic has shown us the inability of markets in labor power to accurately reckon the real value of work. This is another major lesson. So these are some of the things that I think we've been shown. And in fact, I would say it's in the sort of silver lining department, you could not ask for a better lesson in social theory than this COVID pandemic. But of course, that only leaves us with the hard part, which is how to put that lesson to work in social and political practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Minion, you want to jump in and think about this a little bit?
Sure, because it's not intimidating at all to follow that. I first just want to say thank you to Leslie and to Jillian for organizing this. I think that doing this kind of work of bringing together people from disparate perspectives to have conversations, particularly this piece where you're kind of really bringing people together. This is some of that invisible labor that people do in academia. So I really just want to thank you, Leslie, for doing that, and know that it really makes a huge difference, and that a lot of us really appreciate it. I'm very honored to be included in this group as well. So where Nancy ended was actually a really good segue into my what I wanted to address about this, because what she ended with was talking about how the pandemic made visible the essential character of a lot of this work, including care work. And at the same time made visible the kind of chronic devaluation of this work. So I come from I'm a sociologist, I am a policy person. I think about kind of the nuts and bolts and practicalities of moving policy forward. And I see a lot of reasons for hope at this historical moment, in the sense that the pandemic did make starkly visible the essentialness of care work and the enormous cost of not having an adequate care infrastructure. I think there are some signs of that increased visibility in the popular press, stories about the impact of care burdens on families, the impact on women's labor force participation, some attention to paid care workers, although a little bit less, the inadequacy of wages and working conditions, and some attention to the sort of lack of paid leave and other kinds of policies that that become very clearly problematic for all of us and not just for individuals in this kind of context. I would say that there's even some hope on the policy front when I look at sort of the conversations that are happening around care and the way care has been included in some of the first big legislative efforts of this administration in terms of caregiving credits, child tax credits, paid leave, investments in childcare infrastructure, investments in home care infrastructure. The fact that those things are even part of the conversation, I can feel optimistic about that it's even being talked about, because there is a care agenda in this administration in a way that there hasn't been ever before in the history of the United States. And I think that that is optimistic. However, that said, I just want to tell you a story about why I sometimes worry that this, what I perceive as visibility, may not be as widespread or interpreted as the way I think out there, kind of the flip side of this. I'm writing a piece for a media outlet that will remain unnamed about the current debate about whether investments in the care economy should be included as infrastructure, right? This sort of debate that's happening in the public. So I wrote, as a country, we have just witnessed a striking illustration of the extent to which all economic activity depends upon paid care work. As schools went remote and families lost access to other forms of paid care, workers with care responsibilities faced the impossibility of simultaneously caring for a child or other loved one and working their day jobs. Whether they were essential workers who had to go and work in person or work remote. So that's what I wrote. The editor wrote back, quote, "If you want to suggest these workers are as vital as the road that gets me across the river to my job, you have to make this crystal clear. This phrase, for example, face the impossibility of simultaneously caring for a child or other loved one and working their day jobs, isn't very strong. It doesn't make me think these workers are essential. Maybe some people were mildly inconvenienced." Well, I can fully admit that my writing can be strengthened here, and I'm grateful for the feedback to point me in that direction. I was struck by the assertion that caring for a child or older parent at the same time as working in the paid labor force was a mild inconvenience. I wondered if this person, a man, had children. I wondered if he had a wife who absorbed the impact the unpaid care of that unpaid care work in a way that was completely invisible to him. I don't know the answers about this particular individual, but what it did make me aware of acutely is just that what looks to me like visibility might look different to others. And the fact that many women did absorb this extremely increased burden of unpaid care during the pandemic may have in fact rendered it even more invisible to some. So I'll end there.
Wow, that is quite a story. Yes, well, we can talk more about it in a minute. Thank you for that. Maggie, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to echo everybody else's thanks to Jillian and to you, Leslie, for all the work that you've done to bring this all together. It's kind of an interesting point for me to pick up on this idea of visibility, because it's something that I have been thinking a lot about. And in thinking over this question, one of the things that crossed my mind is that one of the things that I see is this sort of unmasking of the necessity of death as an integral part to the way that capitalism functions, right? And Nancy, I think this resonates with some of the stuff that you were talking about sort of cannibalization. So, and so there's both the unmasking of how central death is. I'm thinking in terms of, when we were watching small business owners lobbying politicians to say, you have to open the economy back up, and what that meant for their employees, who are going to have to go back in and risk their lives in order to keep the economy open, right? This was like this narrative that we've heard for the past year of keeping the economy open. And it became very visibly clear that we could not protect life and keep the economy open at the same time, that those two things were not compatible, right? And so I think, this certainly, I think about food workers a lot. This was clearly the case for restaurant workers, for people delivering food, for meat packing workers, all across immigrant farm laborers. And then the other thing that struck me is that there's also this need to cultivate a kind of callousness towards death, that capitalism requires us to sort of cultivate an indifference or a callousness to the death that is required to make capitalism function, to make profit making or that extraction function. And of course, like, none of this is new, right? None of this is actually new. And death doesn't necessarily mean sort of just deaths from COVID. And lots of people have written about this in lots of ways. I'm thinking Ruth Wilson Gilmore's very famous definition of racism, right, as the sort of production or exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And so we saw this not just in terms of who got sick, but the underlying conditions that were contributing to who died from the disease and who was able to make it through. Definitely related to race and class, right? So one of the things that I think sort of became visible is that the necessity of death was no longer deniable, right? We often also sort of are cultivating these stories of plausible deniability. Oh, is that really true? It's debatable. Like, let's look at the data. And a lot of those stories are stories around criminalization. People die under capitalism because they're criminalized. People die under capitalism because they're lazy, right? These are the sort of welfare stories that we hear. Those stories fell away. We didn't have those stories anymore. And it became very clear that people were dying because of these structures that we live under. And I think people were also confronted with that sort of intimately, right? You would go to the grocery store and you would be faced with this person who was there at work serving you, and you were very aware that they were risking their lives to do it, right? So I also think that there was this relational piece of people sort of seeing that. And so I don't know necessarily where this goes. I can kind of see two things happening. And one of the ways I've been thinking about this is that it's a sort of heightening of the contradictions, because the choice that people were given in that moment, right, when we get stripped away all these stories that explain excess death among people of color, among low-income people, suddenly we were faced with this heightened contradiction where you had some people who are fully embracing that callousness, right? We saw this with white supremacist organizing in the United States, the emphasis on reopening economies, not worrying about people's health. It was just an embracing of that callousness. And on the other side, I think you also had many people who were troubled or repulsed by this desire to get them to embrace the callousness that was being put on all of us. And I wonder how that bubbled up in terms of the kind of just outpouring that we saw last summer in the political mobilizations, how that sort of fed into just the massive uprisings that we saw. I don't necessarily know where that goes, but I do think it was something that was exposed, and it is interesting to kind of track what the afterlife of that is going to be going forward. So I'll leave it there.
If you want to just go ahead, that would be great.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you. It's so wonderful. I feel like I don't have to say anything because everything I have to say has already been said by my co-panelists. So I want to also thank Leslie and Jillian for putting us together. We all belong to certain networks of thinking about social reproduction. And then, when you do this kind of work, Leslie, it also identifies for us all the other networks that are working with this kind of framework. So, it's really useful to actually connect in that sort of thinking together way, because many of our work overlaps and it's kind of dependent on someone like you, Leslie, to kind of cohere that together. So that's really been useful anyway for me to think about some of the things that I've been thinking about recently. So thank you. So, I think for me, I want to start with two images, if you like, of visibility. Okay, the first is less grim in a particular sense, in the sense that what comes to mind about visibility is images of women that the New York Times published photos of women working in their closets, in their bathrooms, and in their cars. Okay, so just to find that one little space where someone was not tugging at their sleeves saying, give me a snack, or, I can't, in my case, it would be, Mama, please help me print this schoolwork. Okay, so that little space that women had to create in these absurd times, that's one image of visibility that immediately comes to mind. The other image is far grimmer and more recent. It is funeral pyres, cremation fires burning all over Delhi currently, where the death rate is now the highest throughout the COVID times. And Delhi is where my mom, nearly 80-year-old mom lives, and she still hasn't got her second dose of the vaccine. And the CEO of the company that produces the vaccine has said that we need super profits in order to scale up our production. So the vaccine is not free in India. So that those funeral pyres and the images of women in the US, my two sort of countries, are sort of the bookends for me to understand visibilization during the pandemic. And in that sense, I want to think about, and I've been thinking about COVID, just like Nancy talked about that, Nancy called it a perfect storm. I also want to add to that by saying it's actually been for us working in feminist thinking, an archivist. COVID has been an archivist of past wrongs it has actually exposed all the past wrongs that already existed. It has simply brought them together, in Nancy's words, in a perfect storm. So for me, it's also been an archivist. So this was a sexist political economy to begin with in the United States, and I'll go to India in a minute, where, Minion, you probably know these numbers better than me, where nearly half of all working women worked in low-wage jobs, right? So the low-wage job economy actually is more feminized than ever, and of course, it also is, as Nancy pointed out, predominantly racialized, right? So the low-wage job, and the median earnings is only about $11 per hour. And there simply is not enough affordable childcare options for these women. And so the sort of high price of childcare affects mostly low and middle income mothers and mothers of color, right? So, I mean, I was looking at some statistics, and it turns out that childcare costs in every state exceed the federal definition of affordability, which is 7% of annual household income, right? So basically, nowhere in the United States, the richest country in the world, is childcare affordable in all 50 states, okay? And then you wonder why it is that women leave the workforce, because it just isn't possible to do both things, unlike the editor's perception. So, and that's precisely why, when schools and childcare facilities closed, female employment dropped precipitously during COVID, and but even for people in slightly higher paid jobs for women, they all reported that their working hours, they had to reduce their working hours, right? So, or work in closets and cars and bathrooms. So in India, the situation that I want to point out to is what Nancy talked about with the depletion of social reproduction capacities throughout the period of neoliberalism, which was, in the case of India, at the behest of the IMF and the World Bank, right? So we grew up in the 1970s in India with a robust public distribution system for food, okay? They were called rations. So, every household, we would go to the local ration shop to actually get essential foods, either free of cost, depending on income level, or at a heavily subsidized price by the state, which was the first thing that the IMF said that India would have to cut. And I don't want to blame everything on the IMF. I also want to say that a section of the Indian ruling class was more than eager to actually go with this, dictum of the IMF in order to apportion the blame and the work onto individual families and so on. So of course, from the 1980s, you saw a rise in actual open misogynist state-sponsored propaganda of, because you needed to shore up the heteronormative family, right? Because that's where this work, which was actually taken out of the family, being done by the state, had to move back to the state. So you had to shore those structures up. So misogyny was absolutely on the rise and hasn't abated, and actually has reached alarming proportions of lynching and killing now under the Hindutva, under the Hindu fascist government of Narendra Modi, who, by the way, is totally fine with these vaccines being out of reach and these funeral fires burning. He is out campaigning for elections. So just to come back to the core of the question of how this, as Maggie pointed out, that there has been a callousness, or you know what Lynn Segal in her recent care manifesto called carelessness, that is actually an organizing principle within the current phase of capitalism. But having said that, and having blamed neoliberalism soundly, which I absolutely want to, I also want to say that this is the actual logic of capitalism. This is the logic of capitalism prior to neoliberalism, and even will be if we manage to get rid of neoliberalism and have more state controls on the economy, right? Because the system at its heart depends on competition, not collaboration, and at its heart is about profit making and not about care for human life, okay? Which I have called a deep contradiction between life making and thing making. So capitalism is concerned with thing making, so more and more things and faster, which is why fossil fuels and capitalism is an absolutely happy match. And because so even if we talk about a post-neoliberal world, we have to think about two things right now. There is one path, which is we stabilize these conditions, right? Which is urgently needed. We need to take care of the pandemic. We need to put back some of the Keynesian measures of a post-war economy, you know, all of that. But that is not a permanent solution, because the system at its heart will continue to push the logic of accumulation, and it's only going to be a matter of years or decades till we come to an exactly same position all over again. So I think while we train our sights on the stabilization of the system currently, which we must train our sights on that stabilization with an aim to actually get rid of the system in the long run. In other words, what Rosa Luxemburg has called revolutionary reforms, right? So we do want reforms, but we do not want reforms to stabilize capital. We want reforms to expose the limits of capital to actually sustain human life.
Wow, there's so much there. I just was thinking, oh, you know, I could start every class just by making everybody watch your panel. So I wanted to pick up on a couple of things. I'm really struck by the way the thread around violence and death that is going through everything that you're saying, which is not surprising in the context of COVID and capitalism, but I mean, it is sort of forefronting in the question, I think, that's really made so intensely clear, Mignon, in that story, that we talk about certain things being visible, but it's not self-evident, right? What is going on? It requires a certain kind of lens. It's not visible to everybody. And that's, I think, you know, where people are located really matters. I wanted to ask you all to comment on a sort of more general question that relates to this, I think, which is your sort of choice of language around framework. And I think in your written work, especially, some of you focus much more on social reproduction, which kind of locates this work within capitalism in a formal theoretical sense. And some of you talk more about what's happening with care, questions of care work, questions of food and food access. And it's interesting to me to think about what the stakes are of using language that foregrounds one or the other way of thinking about these. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that a little. Maybe we'll go in the same order, although if you feel like passing or something, that's also fine. And then we can go from there.
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me first say to the three others here how much I enjoyed listening to each of you and how many great resonances I felt among the various presentations. So I use both of these terms, but I think of social reproduction as a more technical term, which aims to sort of think, let's say, systemically, right? With how production is opposed to social reproduction on the one hand, and to ecological reproduction on the other hand, and so on and so forth. So when I use that terminology, I'm really trying to locate something within a system and think about its relation to other elements of the system, and think about tensions and contradictions within the system, and so on and so forth. I think of care, but I often use the phrase care work, and to me that has a more experiential sound, and also a kind of more ethical sound. Someone like Joan Tronto, people have very developed the sense that care work as a practice, right, has embedded with it certain normative perspectives, and that interests me a lot, because I think that that all of the elements that I think of as making up systemically a capitalist society, I think each of them carries what I would call a normative surplus, meaning projects some sort of ideals which the system as such is not able to realize and satisfy, and systematically undermines and undercuts. So I love this discussion about the callousness toward death, and that would be a very good example. And to me, the contradiction between ideals that form part of people's experience, and that they mobilize to criticize this or that, or to justify this or that. These ideals may have a kind of a surplus that can be pushed beyond the bounds of the kind of officially acceptable use. You're supposed to care in the private family, but not, in the economy. Then you have the whole idea that, you could be bad by using the wrong ideal in the wrong sphere, and, things really get interesting. So I would say that both of these terms have a lot of important power and use in the critique of this social system, which, like several other views, I want to name as capitalism. But maybe they pertain to two different levels of analysis. I don't know.
So I would, like Nancy, not position myself as sort of favoring one or the other, but I actually would position my theoretical framing as kind of right at the intersections of social reproduction and care. And most of my scholarship, just to give some context, is about paid care, the paid care workforce, and most of my scholarship is quantitative. So when I'm thinking about these terms, I'm thinking about defining a set of workers under an umbrella. And so what I think is useful about the concept of social reproduction is that it named things as work that had not been considered work before. I think that's one of the central things that social reproduction did. And it also named, as you have mentioned, and others, named the relationship of that work to capitalism and positioned it in that system. And I think those are two really important pieces. What I think is useful about care is that it highlights again, in the context of paid labor specifically, is that it highlights the relational nature of the labor process in care jobs. And it allows us to think about reciprocity in those relationships, and to expand our thinking beyond caring for children and homes to caring for older adults and those who are ill or disabled, which is a little bit harder in a social reproduction model. So I find the concept of care useful in helping us think about these realms of work as a sector united by some common threads. And I think the concept of care has helped us move forward in understanding the mechanisms of devaluation in the paid labor market of this work beyond sort of the theoretical, link to unpaid labor that to really untangle how that's happening. I think the concept of care, I think there's been some good scholarship in recent years that's helped us do that. The thing I will say is that I am actually very wary of what I call the warm and fuzzy version of care. Critical care scholars recognize the dirty and messy pieces of care relationships, as well as all the work of cleaning, cooking, laundry that is part of that care. And in our efforts to recognize that some work is care, we need to not lose sight of one of the critical insights of social reproduction, that care is work. And so I think that sort of warm and fuzzy version of care scholarship, which I actually think is less prevalent now than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, in particular, really privileges the spaces and experiences of white women and really marginalizes the spaces and experiences of BIPOC women. But again, I think care scholarship has come a ways since then. But I do think that that's one of the pieces that again, what I sort of think of as that warm and fuzzy care scholarship, I would not, I'd be wary of. But kind of critical care scholarship and critical social reproduction scholarship, I think, are very go together quite well.
Yeah, I actually, I share that concern about the warm and fuzzy. And I'm really just thinking of, in this moment, we've seen proposals for an actual, funding for families with children, right? Which is a huge breakthrough. But I'm also always a little bit concerned that one of those proposals is coming from Mitt Romney, where, you can sort of imagine his vision, which is this warm and fuzzy, like white mothers caring for their children in these, suburban homes or something. Not that that isn't a very important intervention, but like how we politicize it and how we think about it is crucial. And I think, I also use both of those terms. For me, care really is, I see it as a basic human function. And this is sort of similar to how Joan Tronto sees it. It might also be because I'm an anthropologist. So I really see it as just sort of this basic human function that sustains life, that's necessary. Food work is obviously a huge part of that. And what I see care doing is sort of turning us towards this common humanity, right? Grounding us in a sort of common humanity. And then social reproduction, I find super helpful because it's not just pointing to this fundamental need for care, or even just the labor involved in it, but the contradictions that emerge, specifically under capitalism. So what kind of care is on offer? What kind of people are we creating are necessary in the future to maintain these systems of extraction and profit making? And so, I think what social reproduction does, it's very helpful in my thinking, is that it attunes us to also resistance and rebellion. So if we can identify the kinds of people who are being made to sustain these systems, it also helps us see what has to be disrupted, right? So things like an idea of the family that's super privatized is something that has to be disrupted. I see an analogy, with these sort of two levels with care and social reproduction. When I think about food access, and I'm really influenced here by Ashante Reese, who has done this great work on Black food geographies and her thinking, where we think about food access as kind of a baseline. Everybody needs to eat. That's absolutely true. And it's crucial. It's important, right? We can't ignore it. But just as care is sort of a necessary baseline, all human beings need care in all these different ways. And it's a kind of care that involves tremendous labor, but access itself is not a project of liberation, right? We could have a situation where all people have access to food, and yet we're still very far from actually realizing freedom in the world for all people. And so I think what social reproduction helps us see are kind of those structures that make some kinds of care possible and other kinds of care impossible. And we definitely saw that, over this past year. There was all kinds of money to expand food pantries, even food stamps. but there was no offer to give people the resources they needed to actually stay out of the workforce, to take care of the people in their homes, to stay safe, to stay healthy, right? So I think for me, they're just sort of two levels, but very interrelated.
Right, thanks. So having written a book with the title Social Reproduction Theory, I think I have signed my name to a certain extent. But what I think really, and it's, thank you for that question, Leslie, it really made me think about what is the relationship between those two. And the way I think about it is, I think social reproduction, when I think about it, is the explanatory framework, where care is a much more descriptive, empirical, analytical way to think about social processes. So one is descriptive, one is explanatory in my mind, but of course there is so much overlap, right? So for me, the way I wanted to think about it is, so, we say that unwaged labor in the home is care work, right? So we are taking care of our children, our elders, and so on. But we also say nursing and teaching is care work. But what is it that makes it care work, right? Like, it's not, because the two things are very different. Actually wiping a child's face after a meal, or cooking that meal for the child, and teaching a child in school are very different kinds of work. So what is it that it makes it care? So for me, this is where I think social reproduction theory is useful for me, is what social reproduction theory talks about is that it is actually the social reproduction of labor power, right? So our capacity to work, that's what is socially reproduced. And so when we use that framework, then we see the conditions of production of the labor power in the home, which is all these kind of activities. But labor power is not just it's not just a reproduction in the biological sense, or the maintenance of it in the biological sense. Labor power is also crucially a capacity, right? So the capacity is developed in particular ways, and the work that goes to develop labor power as a capacity, such as education, such as health, such as even public transport systems, which allow labor power to flourish as a capacity. That's what social reproduction theory then brings together. It's conditions of production in which we look at the home, we look at biological processes of reproduction, but also labor power as a capacity, where we have to look not just in the home, but also outside the home. But this brings us to also, if we think about that, social reproduction means the social reproduction of labor power. When we think that way, we also understand, I think, what are the sources of inhibition or inhibiting of those capacities, or impediments to those capacities, right? And that's what brings us back to questions of capitalist structures, which only wants to develop labor power simply to produce profits. But of course, the development of labor power is not completely dependent on capitalism. So, when we teach, yes, we want our students to get jobs, so we do teach them in a particular way, but we also teach them to rebel by teaching all kinds of subversive texts, right? And this happens on a daily basis in all areas of social reproduction. So capacities are developed both to fit into the system, but also to resist the system, right? So I think that brings us, I think that's how I think social reproduction has been useful to me to understand both the conditions of its development, as well as the impediments to its development. So, I think it was Maggie who talked about Ruthie Gilmore, and the phrase that I love about Ruthie's work is the state operating as an institution of organized abandonment, right? Organized abandonment. And that is the actual logic of the capitalist state, that it organizes both social reproduction as well as abandonment. So if you don't socially reproduce labor power in the way state wants you to, then there is an organized abandonment of those bodies and those capacities, right? So, so that's how I kind of see the two aspects fitting in between social reproduction as a framework and care work as a way that delineates that framework.
Thank you so much. You know, I see some people are jumping in and have questions, so I'd like to move to the audience. Isha Baines, did you want to jump in?
Yes. So I was basically kind of focusing more on the US versus India issue, I guess, how Modi doesn't really care about the vaccinations. He doesn't care about those deaths, those funeral pyres, and how the fight for rations, bringing it back to food, I guess, ties to the farmer protests that are happening today as well. But he just doesn't care. And India is jokingly a democracy. So I guess my question is that if the US faced issues like these, the approaches would be different. So how do these powers and authorities help to sustain these vulnerabilities? How we focused on Cuba, specifically, you know, working on their economy and doing different things. How does it work for the US? How do these, once again, how do these powers and authorities help to sustain these vulnerabilities?
Do you want to respond to that before we move to the next question?
Sorry, did you ask me, Leslie? Okay. Right. So I don't think there is a fundamental difference between the way the US government acts and the way the Indian government acts. The Indian government right now is headed by Hindu fundamentalists. So of course there is a political aspect to it that thankfully we did not sort of descend to with the removal of Trump. But we could have well descended into that if Trump had continued to be in power, and there's still and there's still a time, you know, for the white supremacists to kind of adopt that mantle and push for it. But I think in terms of actual economic logic, India is actually doing exactly what a capitalist state needs it to do, right? So it is prioritizing profit. It is making sure that the economy functions. So this is why Modi is absolutely unwilling to declare a COVID emergency, which is needed. And, you know, it is also responding in a way to years of infrastructural lack, which is the result of colonialism as well as capitalism, right? So but Modi is doing something that is greatly approved by capitalism. You know, you should see. And to be honest, it is U.S. governments. We knew who Modi was to begin with. You know, he's an RSS, which is the hard fascist wing of the BJP. Modi was an RSS organizer who came up the ranks through the RSS. He's the butcher of Gujarat who actually organized pogroms. And he also has the great distinction of writing an op-ed column in the New York Times co-authored with Barack Obama. So let us not forget that, you know, sort of the collusion here and the sort of affinity and affiliations between capitalist states and capitalist politicians in different aspects. And I think when you say, what can we do? I think, you know, I go back to the question that, of course, we need short-term measures to actually get out of it, right? So for instance, the demand in the Indian case absolutely should be declare a COVID emergency, stop with the election campaigning, and close things down, give people the money to stay home and not have to go to work, and make the vaccines free. This Serum India Incorporated, which is the vaccine manufacturer, the CEO is going public by saying, how much profit he hopes to make. So absolutely take that under government control. So these are short-term measures, but in the long term, there must be anti-capitalist solutions to these problems, because these problems with a darkening future for our planet will continue to recur unless we train our sights on the system itself.
Nancy, you want to say something about this point?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I really appreciated Tithi's comment. So I think what I would say is that to kind of think about that question, we're really now have to think at the political level. And I want to go back to this question of the time scales that somebody mentioned. I think there are two time scales here, or three, I meant to say, three. So there's the immediate, let's say, level of event of the COVID outbreak. Then there's the pre-existing condition of the last 40 years of financialization and neoliberalization that, as I said, and as others have said, basically destroyed so much of the infrastructures and capacities that we could have used. And then there's the sort of, 400 or 500 years of capitalism. That's the longest one. And like Tithi, I believe that that there is no solution to this that restricts the problem to getting rid of neoliberalism, that we are talking about this much larger and longer history of capitalism. So having said that, I'm hardly an expert on Indian politics, but I would say that that basically the Congress Party is the sort of equivalent of the Clinton-Obama formation in the US. These are what I've called the progressive neoliberals. They have this apparently inclusive, pro-feminist, et cetera, but they are the folks that really created and consolidated a lot of neoliberalization. And they, in a sense, prepared the way by creating such difficult situations for so many people. They prepared the way for these, upstart, rebellious, so-called populists or Hindu nationalists or white supremacists, right, who were claimed to be offering something completely different. And so I think that there might be a kind of parallel at that level. Now, the US, however, is now in, I would call this a compromise formation. Biden presidency is a compromise formation. This goes back to, I think, what Mignon said about sort of seemingly optimistic scenarios by the focus on care and even these questions about how to define infrastructure. In other words, we haven't swung back, at least yet, from Trumpism to straightforward progressive neoliberalism. Right now, because of the strength in the US of the Sanders AOC wing, the emboldened left wing of the Democratic Party, there's something else going on. And I would also invoke Janet Yellen and the Biden economic team. These are not quite the same as the Goldman Sachs alums who had, turned Wall Street loose. They have a quasi or neo-Keynesian idea. They want to prioritize worrying about unemployment vis-a-vis inflation and so on. Of course, they're all free trade and so on and so forth. But anyway, we're in this I would say, fragile compromise. I don't think this compromise can last. I think there are big tensions built into it. But this is what you get in an interregnum. I think we're in an interregnum here, and we don't know whether capitalism actually has more tricks up its sleeve to give us something that could, a new regime that doesn't repeat the old ones, and that could somehow deal with the very pressing, march of global heating and sort of keep things going for a while. But like Tithi, and I think like others, I think we're that this is a moment where outside the box ideas, both on left and right, can get a hearing. And so it's extremely important that we press that question, for example, of what infrastructure is. One thing that just occurred to me as others were speaking was that, social reproduction is a way of expanding our definition of what infrastructure is. And that we have an opening there with that. I would say that, that the planet, that care work, public capacities, that these are all infrastructure, and they have to be maintained. They have to be invested in. I don't just mean financially, although that too. They have to be organized and cultivated and so on. And so maybe that is a way of putting the stress not just on the immediate event and not even just on neoliberalization, although that's a great, again, kind of lesson into how not to maintain infrastructure. But we have this deeper problem in capitalism of maintaining it. That's it.
Absolutely. We have some questions, but Mignon, you wanted to put in a question as well, and I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, my question actually kind of follows on what Nancy was just talking about, but in some ways circles back to the conversation we were having before about the theoretical distinction between social reproduction and care. And I would love to ask, particularly those of you who really are so expert in social reproduction, one of the places I struggle is with thinking about care for older adults and people with disabilities. And one of the places where I feel like thinking about kind of social reproduction and care as infrastructure, thinking about the ways in which the work of social reproduction kind of increases the capacity of labor power and all of those things, I have trouble figuring out theoretically where to fit care for older adults and people with disabilities. And that's one of the things that sort of I find useful about care scholarship, is that I can fit it in that way. So I would love to hear y'all kind of help me out and help me understand and think about, how do we think about where does that fit in think from a theoretical perspective of social reproduction?
Yeah, Tithi, you want to jump in on that? I think it's really important.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Mignon. So wonderful. So, and also to kind of emphasize along with you that, elder care is probably in mainstream media the least glamorous and least talked about, right? So, I mean, everybody from Anne-Marie Slaughter to, Biden is happy to talk about childcare, but elder care is something that is it gets really little attention. So I think this is going back to, this is not my theory, so I want to name check Lisa Vogel. She talks about the reproduction of labor power as taking three forms. One is understood as biological reproduction. One is the maintenance of labor power as it exists, and the other is care of those who have yet to join the labor force or have just transitioned out of the labor force. So all those three combined is her definition of the social reproduction of labor power. So, so the care of children is in a way framed as those who will join, and pensions, for instance, is those who have left the labor force. And increasingly, as you know, much better than me in terms of numbers, that the transition, for those who've transitioned out of the labor force, the resources are the most attacked because this is capitalism has nothing to gain right now, right? Except the sort of pensions are just a way to attract workers to the workplace. But when the economy is rough and workers are just grateful to have a job, people are forced to even consider jobs without pensions. And so dismantling of pension systems are always the first on capitalism's list of how to cut corners and save money. So that aspect of social reproduction theory, which is maintaining the labor power of those who've transitioned out of the system, gets the least attention, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I also always think of this as that people need, labor power isn't just like an object. It is human allocation of activity and energy and creativity, and there has to be something in it for us. And I always think of elder care as the kind of promise that people, faint as it is, that people have, that if they work for, many decades, that they won't sort of die alone on a street corner, and that is part of getting people to work. So in that sense, it is part of literally producing labor power. And so for me, intellectually, when I think about where it fits into that system, to go back to the language that Nancy used before, I think of it as sort of the hegemony piece, the piece that actually encourages people to put their energy out there, even after it's been produced. I don't know, Nancy, if you wanted to say something about this as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question and raises a lot of real hard conceptual difficulties. And I think that I have sort of two different thoughts about it. One is to say that strictly speaking, paying pensions or social security to retired workers on the one hand, or maintaining disabled people who are severely disabled and not able to participate in the paid labor force or whatever. Strictly speaking, these have no value to capital. They are not functional to accumulation. So if these policies exist, it's for some somewhat different reason, namely because working people have fought for them. And I think they represent a political compromise. At another level, a second thought I have is that why have people fought for them? Well, I think, Leslie, you've given some reasons. But partly this makes me want to think that we should probably understand social reproduction in a slightly broader sense than with respect to labor power alone. Although I fully agree that the reproduction of labor power is absolutely central for understanding social reproduction in capitalist societies. But social reproduction goes on in non-capitalist societies as well, and it can also have some broader meanings. So, one thing that I think of is that it's about the social reproduction, not just of the capacity to work, but for social interaction more broadly. And so it in this sense, it would have to do also with contributing and maintaining, I'll use the word infrastructure again, the formations of meaning of value, right, that are integral to a society. In addition, I mean, through which labor takes place, right? So infrastructures of meaning and value. I think social reproduction at work, it maintains or fails to maintain those things when depleted. And so people often talk about, you hear this political phrase, what kind of country do we want to be? Who are we? Are we people who throw people out in the street once they're old or sick? And there's this sense, no, that's not us, or we don't want that to be us. So it's about the reproduction of meaning as well. And that would be, I don't know how Tithi would feel about expanding the idea of social reproduction to include that as well. But and these are the things that people fight for, to understand themselves differently from capital's definition of us, which is as labor power to core in the narrowest sense.
I mean, that's a very interesting longer conversation, but on a more immediate sense as well, workers have parents and grandparents. And so if you don't want all the women to stay home to take care of parents and in-laws and grand uncles, and you want to draw them into the labor force with, in order to exploit them, then you need to have something in place for those family members as well. So that's a much more functional way to also think about, to add on to what Nancy and Leslie have already said.
Yeah, that was sort of my question, is if that might not also be in the same way that women, need to take care of children. People have a real resistance to not seeing their parents or grandparents cared for. And so, and when I was doing ethnographic research, I met many people who ended up having to take time to care for an adult, an older adult, and then go back into labor force, not be able to get back into the labor force. So it certainly smooths out that labor function for working aged adults.
Oh, that was a great question, actually, very thought-provoking. If somebody wants to ask a question here, Asham, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for this amazing and insightful panel. I have a question about social reproduction and motherhood, kind of in response to Maggie Dickinson's point about Mitt Romney's support for child tax credits and how Biden is like very happy to talk about childcare. And then Tithi Bhattacharya, you pointed out the kind of new visibility of mothers feature like in the New York Times, working in their cars and closets. And I was wondering how much you all think that this increased concern kind of the political elite and the media in care work is about certain women being exposed as kind of not, quote unquote, like not good mothers, like middle-class women, middle-class working women, as being exposed as not good mothers. And then in terms of kind of revolutionary reforms, like what reforms would we want to see, or would you want to see that stabilize the conditions of motherhood and parenthood, but don't end up kind of glorifying certain types of motherhood or motherhood for certain people and not others?
Do you want to start on
that? I'll just say real quickly, it's a great question. So thank you for that. I think I'm never opposed to getting working people money. So I want to start there. It's never a bad thing. I'm never opposed to it. But I think we just have to be very, very cautious in terms of that. We know that welfare provisioning has continually, shaped our ideas of family formation. What is an acceptable family? What is a deserving family or an undeserving family? And so one of the dangers that I actually see in this moment is a sort of reification, particularly around conflating motherhood and parenthood, right? So that the care for children is something that has to happen. It doesn't have to happen by women. It doesn't have to happen right in these particular family formations. And so I think one of the things that I'm really cautious about is that there will be some compromises, particularly with, kind of focus on the family kind of folks where we're like, yes, we want to get money to people and we will accept some restrictions, some redefinitions that again sort of reprivatize, redefine parenthood or the necessary care of raising children into privatized families that don't see, for example, the way that queer families, extended families, low-income families who may take in children who are not biologically theirs, right? These are all things I just think we have to be really attentive to in this moment, because I see the danger of a potential backslide.
So I'll just add to that, which is, first of all, thanks for asking this question. And I think a lot of queer theorists have gotten to this question, especially during COVID times, to talk about family abolition, right? So that's one way. And I don't know if I would say family abolition is the way I frame the abolition of the family. The way I frame the abolition of the family is more sort of on the Kollontai kind of way, that the family should be a site for real love, right? Right now, the family is a site for the reproduction of labor power. Okay, so all the work, etc., that the state has abandoned, that the infrastructures have abandoned, is now left to the family. In fact, there is very little time for love within the family, okay? It's just work and unwaged, unappreciated, and as Minions, I can't forget that editor points out, is not even visible. So so I think the solution is, as Maggie says, to expand the notion of parenting, okay, which includes queer networks, kinship ideas, but also to evacuate the family of these functions, okay? So these functions of, food, daily production of food, daily laundry, cleaning, all of these could be actually taken out of the family and put into the public sphere, the way, Kollontai imagined it, right? When I say we abolish the kitchen, doesn't mean that you never cook for yourself or your child or your lover. It simply means that cooking becomes a real choice, that you only cook if you want to, rather than I have to do it, especially after I've come back from my work and, there is no time and it's just such a hassle, right? So that, I think, these twin projects need to be followed. One is expansion of what we mean by kinship networks, and the other is evacuating the family of certain tasks such that the family becomes the site of love rather than simply the site of the work that capitalism refuses to pay for.
That was a great ending. I feel like there's so much more to say, but that just seems like a great place to end. We're actually at Berkeley, we're in the middle of a fight about paid family leave, and actually working for paid family leave without reinforcing the heteronormative family is just a terrible conundrum in the actual ways that the question is posed. And so I think it's a really, really important question for all of us, and I appreciate those responses. So I just want to say thank you all for just your work before this and the work you'll do going forward, and for your wonderful contributions over the semester and today. And I thank you to the audience for joining us, and we hope to see you all in person at some point very soon.